As long as I operate with integrity and I take this opportunity and use it and as a way to as an expansion of my work, then I feel comfortable in doing that. I don't
Mm.
necessarily have anything like Hollywood. I'm old, right? Hollywood at 25 would have been the lick. You know what I'm saying? In my own terms. What does Me Too make possible?
Melanin goddess that's before me. Hello. On this episode of Another Act, I chat with activist Tarana Burke about her new book, her hopes for her new Hollywood deal, the Me Too movement, and the thing that initially got her activated in the first place.
Tarana, your journey as an activist began a long time ago. What initially activated you? What were you seeing?
Well, I mean, I initially was activated as a teenager, and we had a very similar set of circumstances in the late 80s and 90s, definitely in New York, where there were huge stories coming out of our communities, like similar to Trayvon Martin, we had Yusef Hawkins, we had the Central Park Five, we had these really big cases that were coming out of our communities where of police brutality, of Black youth being railroaded. And I was very much activated by that. But I also grew up in a very sort of conscious family with a lot of Black consciousness. So I was
Mm.
acutely aware of injustice and could identify injustice. So those are the things that initially activated me.
Yeah. What made you decide to write a book at this point? And where were you in the course of the Me Too movement when you decided that this was the right time for Unbound?
What made me write the book, I got when Me Too went viral, like right away, I got all these invitations to write books, these offers to write books. And I didn't want to write a memoir at first. I wanted to write a book about survival. And
Mm.
I thought this was a great time to write a book to help people understand what survival looks like. At the
Mm.
point that I started, it felt really important that I tell my story on my own terms, that it not be this sort of collection of sound bites that had, been happening since 2017. I never
Yeah.
really got to tell my story. I tell it in snippets and bits and pieces, and I wanted to tell it at my own pace, from my own mouth.
Absolutely. Where did you start with the book? Because your story, like you said, the pieces that we've heard, over the last few years at least, I think in its totality is going to be a new experience, for people to learn more about you. So where did you start and what was your process like when you actually started putting pen to paper?
So I had old writings that I'd done, some blogs that I wrote, essays that I never published anywhere. So I started out by pulling out those things. And I have a friend who's a writer who gave me a great writing prompt, and she had me write every single memory I had. And I started with those two things, and then she helped me create a timeline of the most relevant things that brought me to the moment of starting this work. And so it was sort of it wasn't technical necessarily, but more technical than you would think. It was like weaving together these essays and where were the gaps in that, filling that in. And then the story, I also have journals going all the way back to the eighth grade. I mean, I don't think there could have been a book without my journals, because there was this really interesting process of writing a story and then going back to that time period and reading what my 12-year-old or 14-year-old or 16-year-old self thought, and thinking, oh, okay, maybe I'm putting too much of my adultness in this. This is not what I actually thought then.
Yeah.
Which was really, it was fun, but it was hard at sometimes.
When you think about the work that you are doing as an activist, how do you measure success? Like what's the traction that you use or the metrics that you use to say this is doing what I intended it to be doing?
It's different than what most people think. I think what a lot of people would use as metrics are, the court cases that are won, or the laws that are passed. The metric I use is different, and the metric that I want people to use is different. So, for instance, in the case we've had recently with Governor Cuomo stepping down,
Mm.
there are some people who say, "Well, this is a victory for the Me Too movement," but if you count that as a victory for the Me Too movement, when something happens like Cosby getting out of jail, then you count that as a victory against the Me Too movement. And that's
Mm,
not the metric. The metric is the investigation that led to the resignation, right?
okay.
What
Yeah.
I look at is not, what has happened because of Me Too. It's what is Me Too made possible,
Mm,
right? It's not the let's count all the laws that have changed. Let's count all the cases that have won. Let's count all the men who lost their jobs or the people who are blah, blah, blah. 5 years ago, you couldn't have got a Weinstein verdict.
mm,
5 years ago, you couldn't have got an attorney general to do a thorough investigation against a sitting governor. That
yeah.
means that we're thinking differently about sexual violence and we're reacting differently to sexual violence. I don't know that people understand how huge that is because they're looking at the singular moment, right? The singular moment of the hashtag going viral is so big that people are like, well, this is a huge thing. Of course we deal with sexual violence, but we don't.
Yeah.
I'm tracking the progress and how people think about sexual violence, how they respond to it, the resources that survivors have access to, the comfort that survivors have in disclosure. Like those are the places that we are seeing far more progress than we've seen in the past decade.
Yeah. To that, how is the visibility of the movement help with the work that you were doing as an activist before things went viral? Like, is that feeding into, this quieter space that you were working in before Hollywood got involved?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are downsides to visibility, but the huge upside is there's no scenario that I could have written. There's no amount of organizing I could have done, no campaign I could have launched that could have gotten this level of visibility. There's no magazine that's going to put a 44-year-old Black woman from the Bronx on the front page because she's talking about sexual violence, right? That's just not it's not going to happen. There are no TED talks that are by obscure people doing work in the community like I was doing. So it has elevated my work and elevated the platform, the number of people I get to reach, the amount of resources I have access to, right? All of those things spread the message. And my job is to be a good steward of the visibility and a good steward of the opportunity that's been given to me
Yeah.
until the next thing happened.
Yeah. Speaking of Hollywood, congratulations on your CBS overall deal. At what point were you in this movement where you said, we probably need to do content too?
That was it. Again, it was not in my like vision of the work
Yeah.
necessarily. I saw myself maybe building, trying to expand the landscape of the movement and building more organizations or helping people expand their organizations. Really, Hollywood came to me. This is an opportunity, and we'd love to have you. And I mean, real being 100% real, we know how this is. It's transactional, so these
Yeah.
people want to be associated with you because it makes their brand better, it makes them be more responsible, what have you. But there is also an opportunity to do some good work in the process. So I felt like going into it with my eyes wide open, knowing all of this is transactional. Like this is not like out of the kindness of your heart. This is like we all you gain something, but I do too. And as long as I operate with integrity and I take this opportunity and use it and as a way to as an expansion of my work, then I feel comfortable in doing that. I don't
Mm.
necessarily have anything like Hollywood. I'm old, right? Hollywood at 25 would have been the lick. You know what I'm saying? But I mean, in all jokes aside, like I don't
Yeah.
have a there's no usefulness in longevity in like just being in Hollywood for Hollywood's sake. But
Mm.
if there's going to be a reciprocal or transactional relationship, then I want to make the best use of that. I want somebody who is watching the stories that I put out to understand my work differently.
Right. You and I know very well the importance of images and of and how that affects how people view the world. And this last year and a half, we've spent so much time, certainly in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, talking about the importance of what we see on television and film. And that conversation about needing to make sure we're being progressive trickled over into Hollywood too. Now that you have this deal in Hollywood, are you feeling more encouraged about the conversations changing? Now that you have a seat at the table, are you feeling a little bit better about what's to come?
What I'm seeing in Hollywood, you have people like me, Malala, Patrice Cullors, like Ibram Kendi, like the people who are getting these deals now are not just creatives, but these are folks who have histories in organizing and activism and academia who bring a particular set of experiences so that the what we're trying to produce is an extension of our work.
Yeah, I know it's early in for you, but have you thought about what types of projects you would love to contribute to our TV dials? What's something that maybe we can look forward to as far as your prism of how you view the world is concerned?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I also don't want people to think, well, we're gonna get us a bunch of shows about rape, right? This is just gonna be the Me Too. You're just gonna keep producing shows about, sexual violence, sexual assault. I certainly want people to understand the landscape of sexual violence more and more clearly and connect to it more in depth. But my work is bigger and broader than that. It's really about humanity. And I have a queer child that is gender nonconforming. And I would love to see more stories about gender identity on television, right? That's another
Mm,
narrative that we don't explore enough and people need to hear. We should not be arguing about who's using whose bathrooms and trans kids and this kind of thing because people don't get it and they don't understand it. I'm
mm.
also interested in, whenever we hear diversity and to hear more Black shows, we think we get another show, and this is no shade to anybody, but we get another show about 20 something year old skinny Black kids, Black girls. And I would love to see over 40 yeah, Black women of all shapes and sizes on television. That would be lovely to get into the material lives, not just as aunties, not just as peripheral and the wisdom, but like I have friends who are struggling with things like fertility. I have
Yeah.
friends who are getting married for the first time, having children for the first time, who are empty nesters, right? So yeah, I think this whole I like diversity kind of just gets you kind of just slap a face on it and you don't really dig into the nuance of that. But we have really interesting lives in all kind of ways, and I'd love to explore that.
I love that. And I love you specifically for really making this conversation, like you said, much more normalized. I think that you saw it in encouraging women to be very vocal about what was happening to our bodies and things that we quietly held to ourselves. And I think that right there was so significant. I know you hear this all the time, but thank you so much for your voice and your presence and your power. Very excited for this new book and very excited for this next chapter for you.
Oh, thank you so much. I so appreciate it.